A typewriter page slowly rolls out, one name stamped in red ink, Elena Müller. The sound of boots in the distance, paper being ripped, canned fire crackling in the dark. They said Elena's betrayal destroyed more men than bullets ever could. Her name appears again and again inside a report the world was never meant to read. A file so dangerous armies tried to burn every last copy. But one survived, and inside it lies the truth about loyalty, temptation, and destruction. The typewriter fell silent, yet her name echoed in the shadows, clinging to every wall, every corridor of history that tried to forget her. Elena was not a soldier. She never wore a uniform, never carried a weapon, but her choice would come to weigh heavier than artillery. Generals cursed her. Governments feared her, and soldiers whispered about her in the dark, as though even speaking her name might bring ruin, because what Elena Müller did was more than treason. It was something the war was not prepared for, a betrayal wrapped in beauty, sealed with tenderness, carried through whispers. The file calls her Case Zero, the opening wound. The first proof that betrayal does not need to march with an army. Sometimes it walks quietly into your home. Her story began in a ruined city where hunger gnawed like a beast. Bombs thundered at night, and the walls of her apartment shook with every strike. By day, she played the piano, her fingers trembling on the keys, trying to remember life before the war. She was 24, married to an officer who worshipped loyalty as if it were carved into his bones. But loyalty was a fragile thing in the winter of war, when bread was scarce and loneliness was colder than snow. One night, when the streets were swallowed in smoke, there was a knock on her door. Not her husband. Not a friend, a stranger, wearing the wrong uniform. The report does not tell the story like a tragedy. It tells it like a calculation. Subject EM, female, 24, displayed high susceptibility to persuasion, engaged in emotional and physical compromise, transferred intelligence concealed in sheet music. Result: entire battalion ambushed. Estimated casualties 1,500 men, wiped out because of one woman's choice. To the army, Elena was not human. She was evidence. She was numbers on a page, but behind those numbers lived a woman who wept into her piano at night, whose hands trembled as she baked stale bread, who carried the silence of a city that had lost its breath. The generals called it treason. The file called it proof, but what it truly was hunger, loneliness, and the human need to feel alive, even in the shadow of death. The deeper the file went, the darker it grew. Elena's name was only the first. Others followed. Dozens of women, scattered across towns and villages, all accused of betrayal. One delivered a secret letter hidden in bread. Another let slip a soldier's route between lovers. Whispers. Some were guilty of nothing more than loving a man in the wrong uniform. Each story bled onto the page like a confession carved into flesh. The file did not call them women. It called them subjects. It did not call it love. It called it emotional treason. And yet, hidden between the cold words, one terrifying idea emerged. Betrayal was more contagious than loyalty. That was the conclusion generals could never allow to see daylight. If loyalty at home could not be trusted, then loyalty on the battlefield was already broken. The fear was not just of spies. It was of collapse of families, collapse of armies, collapse of nations, and so they burned the file. They tore its pages, stamped them classified, and fed them to the fire. But fire cannot erase truth. Smoke cannot bury shame. One copy lived. One fragile hidden copy carried Elena Müller's name across the decades. And now, as you hear this, that copy has opened again. The ink has bled through time, her name refuses to fade, and the whispers return. Elena Müller was not a myth. She was the first spark in a storm of betrayal. Her file was not just a report, it was a prophecy, and this was only the beginning. The forbidden file is thicker than the flames ever allowed. The next page is waiting. Another name is stamped in red. The flames were meant to erase it, but one copy survived. Inside those torn pages, the ink bled darker, carrying names the world was never meant to hear. Elena Müller was only the beginning. Her betrayal opened the wound. But the file grew thicker with every page, with every story carved out of silence and shame. At the top of the next sheet, stamped in the same cruel red, Isabelle Laurent. She was a nurse in Paris, her hands trained to heal, her voice meant to soothe. By day she bound wounds, stitched torn flesh, and whispered courage into dying ears. Soldiers clung to her touch, as though it were the last warmth they would ever feel. But the night told a different story. The study claimed her satchel carried more than bandages. Between rolls of gauze, coded slips of paper lay hidden, passed into the hands of strangers wearing the wrong colors, speaking the enemy's tongue. The report wrote her name coldly. Subject IL, suspected of systematic compromise. Probability of intentional betrayal, 89%. Yet the truth behind her eyes was not captured in numbers. Isabelle was in love. That much even her accusers whispered. A love forbidden, a love across enemy lines. She believed the man who held her heart could end the war. She believed betrayal was sacrifice, that treason was salvation if it brought peace. But the file did not care for love. It cared only for outcomes, and the outcome was blood, one ambushed convoy. 70 dead. A single nurse with gentle hands blamed for all of. The other generals spat her name like poison. The Tsuai study used her as proof, but the soldiers she nursed remembered her differently. For them, her betrayal was not black and white. It was the blurred shade between mercy and destruction. And so Isabelle Laurent joined Elena Müller in the Hall of Shadows. 2 names, 2 betrayals. The file warned there would be more. The deeper the pages turned, the more suffocating the study became. It was not research, it was prophecy. A prophecy of trust collapsing, of faith bleeding away in silence. One section was marked, Chain Reaction. It told of how betrayal spreads like fire. One man learns his wife has turned to another. His spirit cracks. On the battlefield he hesitates. His hesitation infects his comrades. A unit breaks. A line collapses. And in that collapse a nation shudders. The study's conclusion was brutal. The destruction of armies begins not with enemy fire, but with the whispers of those they love. This was the truth governments could not afford to show their men. Because if a soldier believed betrayal waited at home, how could he lift his weapon abroad? And so they buried the study. They burned its pages. But betrayal is not ash. It survives. Even as the file blackens, the names shine through the smoke. Women who carried secrets in letters, in lullabies, in promises whispered behind closed doors, the report branded them all the same. Subjects, variables, threats. But each name carried a story too human to be measured, too heavy to be erased. The final page of the surviving section ends with a single warning. The contagion of betrayal cannot be contained. It corrodes faith, collapses order, and consumes nations from within. What began with Elena Müller will not end until trust itself is extinct. And then, silence, the typewriter stops. The file closes. But the ink is still wet. The forbidden study has revealed its ghosts. Elena, Isabelle, and countless nameless others. But what happens when the whispers of betrayal leave the pages and enter the hearts of soldiers themselves? Because once trust breaks at home, it does not stay at home. It follows men to the battlefield. It follows them into the trenches. It follows them into death, season. 3 begins with that collapse. The war is no longer fought between nations. It is fought inside the hearts of men who no longer know whom to trust. The file warned it. The generals feared it, and then it happened. The contagion left the pages and entered the battlefield. It began quietly, like cracks in glass. A whisper in the trench, a letter read in silence, a soldier's face pale under the moonlight. And then suddenly the collapse spread. A captain named Reinhardt was the first recorded. His men said he carried a folded letter everywhere, tucked into the pocket near his heart. It was from his wife. At night, while shells burst overhead, he would read her words by candlelight. She wrote of waiting, of faith, of loyalty. But one night a new letter came. It was shorter, colder, written in a hand that seemed hurried, unfinished. Do not return. I have chosen another. The next morning, Reinhardt walked into battle without raising his rifle. His men screamed his name, but he did not answer. Bullets tore him down, and with him fell the line he was meant to hold. The study had been right. Betrayal could kill without a weapon. Another entry described Corporal Weiss. He discovered through intercepted whispers that his sister had been accused of aiding the enemy. The accusation was enough to rot his spirit. In the next ambush, when ordered to fire, he froze. His hesitation cost the lives of the men beside him. A compromised heart equals a compromised army. The report's words were no longer theory. They were reality. The collapse spread like disease. Men deserted not from fear of the enemy, but from fear of betrayal waiting at home. Soldiers grew suspicious of each other. If their wives, their sisters, their mothers could betray them, who among their comrades could be trusted? Faith bled out of the trenches. Courage cracked under suspicion. An army cannot march on broken hearts. Hook. The war was no longer about borders. It was about trust. And trust was dying faster than men. The file's surviving copy described a chilling phenomenon. Letters from home, once treasures, became weapons. Every folded page carried not comfort, but terror. Soldiers opened envelopes with shaking hands, praying for reassurance but fearing betrayal. And when the words inside spoke of silence, distance, or worse, another man, something inside them shattered. Some wept, some raged, some walked willingly into bullets, as though the battlefield was easier than the truth. The generals tried to stop it. They censored letters, they silenced rumors, they executed men accused of treason. But betrayal is not smoke to be smothered. It is fire that finds a way through every crack. Entire units began to dissolve, not under artillery but under doubt. Men who once shouted brother now eyed each other with suspicion. The enemy grew stronger, not because of strategy, but because trust itself was collapsing. And in the middle of this collapse, the file revealed another name, a name stamped in red, heavy as blood. Klara Vogel. She was the daughter of a merchant, raised in the safety of a quiet town. But war does not leave quiet untouched. The report accused her of passing coded notes hidden in bread loaves. She claimed she was forced, threatened by soldiers who would burn her family alive if she refused. The generals called her guilty. The study called her inevitable. Subject KV demonstrated collapse under coercion. Reinforces conclusion. Loyalty is conditional, not absolute. But in her broken testimony, written in trembling handwriting, another truth was visible. I did not want to betray him, but I wanted my mother to live. Betrayal was not simple treachery. It was survival painted in blood. The forbidden file, by the time it reached this section, no longer sounded like research. It sounded like mourning, as though even the cold typewriter keys had begun to weep. It repeated one warning, again and again like a drumbeat of doom. When the home is poisoned, the front will fall. The collapse had begun, and yet the file was not finished, because betrayal does not end in battle. It follows. It lingers. What happens when the war is over, and the soldiers who survived return home carrying suspicion like a second skin? What happens when men who gave everything realize that even victory cannot erase betrayal? The last lines of this section close with a single chilling prophecy. The war will end, but the collapse of trust will outlive the battlefield. Betrayal does not die when peace is declared. It breeds in silence, in marriages, in families, until nations are hollowed from within. The typewriter stops. The ink dries, but the file is not closed. A final section remains. The last copy waits, its last page hidden under layers of ash and silence. Season 4 will open it, and inside lies the ending no fire could erase. The flames devoured almost everything. Armies tore the pages, stamped them classified, buried them in ash. But history does not burn so easily. One copy survived. One file refused to die. It surfaced decades later, hidden in the false bottom of an old oak chest, discovered by hands that were never meant to touch it. The pages were blackened, edges brittle, but the name still burned in red. Elena Müller, Isabelle Laurent, Klara Vogel, and dozens more, their stories written like curses that had outlived the men who condemned them. The historian who found it wrote in his journal, "This file is not research. It is a wound. It bleeds every time the page is turned." Because by then the truth had already proven itself. Empires had risen and fallen. Wars had ended and begun again. And yet the echo of betrayal had never left. The final section of the file bore no names, no statistics, no evidence. Only a single heading, legacy. It began with a sentence that froze the historian's blood. The collapse of trust is permanent. Once fractured, it does not heal. It multiplies. The file explained that betrayal is not an event. It is a seed. Once planted, it grows in silence, twisting through families, poisoning marriages, turning brothers against each other, lovers into enemies, nations into graves. Elena's betrayal may have killed soldiers, Isabelle's may have doomed convoys. Klara's may have broken oaths. But the file warned that the greater destruction was not counted in numbers. Say it was counted in what could never be rebuilt. Hook. You can rebuild cities. You can bury the dead. But you cannot resurrect trust. The historian turned the last brittle page and found words underlined in black. The greatest enemy of any nation is not beyond its borders. It is the silence between two people who no longer trust each other. Those words carried more weight than any weapon, because even in times of peace, betrayal lingered like smoke in the lungs of the living. Men returned from battle, broken not by shells but by doubts. Wives waited at windows, unsure if the silence was love or judgment. Families fractured under secrets no one dared to speak. The file's final prophecy was the darkest of all: war's end. Betrayal does not. It is eternal. The historian closed the folder with trembling hands. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, voices laughed, life continued. But he knew what he held was not just a record of the past. It was a mirror of the present, because even now betrayal still ruled in whispers, in glances, in letters unsent, in phones unanswered. The forbidden file had never truly been buried. It lived inside every human heart. And so the story of Elena Müller, Isabelle, Laurent, Klara, Vogel, and the countless nameless others did not die with the war. It survived. It walked into the homes of the living. Hook. Every love carries a shadow. Every oath carries a crack. Every heart carries the possibility of betrayal. The last line of the file was stamped, not typed. A single phrase, smeared as if the ink itself trembled. This is not history. This is prophecy. The historian locked the file away again. But he knew it was useless, because you cannot burn what already lives inside the human soul. The last copy survives, and as long as it does, so does the truth it carries.